The 1,000 years of peace had turned war into a myth, something taught in history archives with the same detached curiosity as ancient plagues or extinct animals. And humanity had grown comfortable in the idea that violence was an old flaw they had finally outgrown, a childish phase of a younger species, because for 10 centuries there had been no borders defended by force, no armies marching, no weapons aimed at living targets, only research fleets, trade corridors between stars, and cities that glowed softly at night like constellations resting on the surface of Earth. The foundation of this era was a silent agreement with the galaxy itself, a non-interference pact established after humanity's first accidental contact with an ancient interstellar coalition known only through translated records as the Custodians, beings who had watched countless civilizations rise and collapse, and who believed humanity would either mature into something peaceful or burn itself out quickly. And when the treaty was signed, humanity promised expansion without conquest, technology without domination, and exploration without weapons. And for 1,000 years they kept that promise so well that even the memory of fear faded. Children laughed when educators explained concepts like invasion and extinction. Adults rolled their eyes at conspiracy theorists who insisted the Custodians would one day return, and the stars became background scenery rather than a source of threat. It did not travel through radio or light, but through every network at once, bypassing firewalls, quantum encryption, and biological neural links, appearing simultaneously on screens, implants, public displays, and even the ocular interfaces of pilots mid-flight. A simple statement translated perfectly into every human language without accent or emotion. The 1,000-year peace is over. War has been declared. There was no signature, no coordinates, no demands, and for exactly 7 seconds, the planet was silent. Then humanity laughed. People assumed it was a prank orchestrated by a rogue artificial intelligence collective, a marketing stunt for a holo-series, or a stress test by planetary governance. Memes exploded across networks depicting cartoon aliens shaking fists. Comedians streamed live reactions, mocking the idea of war as outdated. Stock markets barely flickered, and emergency councils delayed meetings because no one believed there was an emergency. The Custodians had never broken protocol before, and even if some unknown species existed beyond known space, the idea that they would threaten humanity was almost funny, because humanity no longer saw itself as a fragile civilization hiding on one planet, but as a calm, rational species spread across dozens of systems with automated defenses dismantled centuries earlier because they were no longer needed. It took 12 hours for the first anomaly to be noticed, not by military sensors because there were none active, but by a deep space cartographer mapping gravitational drift near the Oort boundary, who noticed that stars were not where they should be, not moving fast, not emitting energy, just wrong, as if reality itself had been gently folded. The data was forwarded to a planetary science forum, where it was debated casually until a second report arrived from a mining habitat near Europa, where the night sky had briefly darkened, not from an eclipse, but from something vast passing between the station and the stars without reflecting light. Even then, the tone remained curious rather than afraid, because fear was a muscle humanity had not exercised in generations. The first official response came from the Unified Earth Assembly, calm, measured, and almost bored, assuring citizens that there was no evidence of hostile intent, and advising everyone to continue daily activities while investigations continued. And that statement would later be remembered as the last truly peaceful announcement in human history. The invasion did not begin with explosions or fleets or fire. It began with silence. Entire colonies going offline without distress calls. Communications simply ending, as if someone had reached out and gently switched them off. And when probes were dispatched, they returned nothing, because they did not return at all. Disappearing without debris, without energy signatures, without explanation. Still, there was laughter, nervous now but present. Jokes about dramatic aliens who forgot to show up properly. Until the first visual contact occurred above Mars, where astronomers observed a structure unfolding from nothing, not arriving, but emerging. A geometry that hurt to look at because it did not follow perspective or scale. Its surface reflecting no light, yet clearly visible against the stars like a wound in space. And from it came a second message, shorter this time, delivered not through networks, but directly into human auditory perception. We warned you, and that was when humanity stopped laughing. Emergency councils convened. Ancient defense protocols were pulled from archives like relics. Fabrication systems began rebuilding weapons from blueprints last updated 800 years earlier. And for the first time in living memory, fear returned, raw and unfamiliar, because the realization spread that whatever was coming did not respect the rules humanity understood. The custodians finally responded, breaking 1,000 years of silence with a transmission filled with something close to regret, confirming that the attackers were known. An extragalactic species that consumes civilizations, not for resources, but for certainty, erasing unpredictability wherever it emerged. And humanity had become unpredictable, too creative, too adaptive, too dangerous to be left alone. The custodians admitted they could not intervene directly without violating ancient laws older than stars. But they offered one piece of advice that confused everyone who heard it. Do not try to match them. Do not try to scare them. Do not try to reason with them. And above all, do not show fear. And when pressed for explanation, the custodians went silent again. As the alien structures multiplied, humanity prepared for a war it had forgotten how to fight. But something strange happened when the first human-built defense platform activated near Jupiter and fired experimental energy lances at an approaching anomaly. The weapons worked, not by overwhelming force, but by doing something unexpected. The alien structure recoiled, not damaged, but startled, as if it had not considered resistance a possibility. And that moment was recorded, analyzed, and replayed across every command center, revealing a truth that shifted the mood from despair to something sharper. Humanity had changed during its 1,000 years of peace, not grown weaker as the attackers assumed, but stranger, more inventive, less predictable, their technology no longer designed to dominate, but to solve, to adapt, to improvise. And when pushed into conflict, they did not revert to old patterns of aggression, but created new ones that did not fit any historical model. The aliens advanced cautiously now, their movements slowing, their formations adjusting. And for the first time since the declaration of war, a human officer was seen smiling during a crisis briefing, because it dawned on them that the enemy expected screaming, panic, and chaos, not calm analysis and quiet creativity. And the laughter that had followed the declaration had not been ignorance, it had been instinct, a refusal to grant fear the authority it demanded. Humanity did not respond with a declaration of its own. No threats, no speeches, no dramatic gestures. Instead, they sent a single probe toward the largest alien structure, not armed, not shielded, carrying only a library of human art, music, humor, and absurdity. Everything that made no tactical sense. And when the probe vanished like all the others, humanity waited, not in silence, but in quiet confidence. Because somewhere deep down they understood that this war would not be won by strength or numbers, but by something far more dangerous to an enemy obsessed with control. The human ability to adapt, to laugh in the face of extinction, and to become something entirely new when survival demanded it. Humanity waited for retaliation, but none came immediately. And that delay became the most terrifying weapon the invaders possessed, because uncertainty spread faster than fear ever had. Commanders watched silent maps, where enemy positions refused to resolve into predictable vectors. Scientists argued whether the probe's disappearance meant destruction or capture. and civilians, now aware that laughter had given way to something real, struggled to remember how a species was supposed to behave when extinction was once again a possibility. The custodian's warning echoed through every strategic council. Do not show fear. And it became less a suggestion and more a survival principle, because analysis of alien behavior revealed something unsettling. They did not rush. They did not threaten further. They simply observed, adapting to reactions rather than initiating chaos, as if humanity itself were being studied as a variable in an equation older than time. The first confirmed human casualty occurred not on a battlefield, but in a research station orbiting Saturn, where an astrophysicist suffered a neural overload while attempting to model the invaders' spatial geometry. Her last recorded words describing a pattern that learned faster the more it was observed. And that discovery changed everything, because it implied the enemy fed not on matter or energy, but on certainty, on stable models of reality. And human unpredictability disrupted that process. The Unified Earth Assembly authorized something unthinkable just days earlier. The decentralization of command, dismantling hierarchical decision trees, and replacing them with distributed autonomous creativity cells, composed of scientists, artists, engineers, philosophers, and artificial intelligences, trained not for efficiency, but for novelty. And for the first time in history, a war effort was guided by people whose primary skill was not obedience, but imagination. When the alien structures advanced toward Earth's inner defense perimeter, they encountered not resistance in the traditional sense, but confusion. Gravitational fields shifted erratically. Communication signals contradicted themselves. Defensive platforms behaved inconsistently, sometimes retreating, sometimes broadcasting meaningless data, sometimes doing nothing at all. And this lack of pattern caused measurable hesitation in the invaders' movements, as if they were recalibrating against a threat that refused to be defined. Analysts confirmed it soon after. The enemy's predictive models were degrading, probabilities collapsing instead of converging, and every attempt to impose order resulted in further instability, which led to a chilling realization. The war was not about destruction. It was about forcing humanity into predictability, because once humanity behaved like every other civilization before it, defeat would be inevitable. In response, humanity did something no previous species had attempted. They weaponized culture, broadcasting conflicting narratives, contradictory strategies, humor layered with tragedy, logic paired with absurdity, flooding the invaders' perception space with irreconcilable data. And for the first time, an alien structure was observed withdrawing, not damaged, not destroyed, but disengaging, as if overwhelmed. This moment marked the true beginning of the conflict, not because weapons were fired, but because intent was finally understood on both sides. The custodians returned once more, their message fragmented and strained, warning that humanity was approaching a threshold no civilization had crossed before, a point where survival required becoming something fundamentally incompatible with the cosmic order that had governed life for eons. And they asked a question rather than issuing advice. Are you willing to change in ways you cannot reverse? Humanity did not answer immediately, because the truth was terrifying. Adaptation at this scale meant abandoning the comfort of being understood, even by allies, even by themselves. And yet the alternative was extinction by conformity. The invaders escalated then, deploying reality-sharing constructs that erased entire probability branches, causing futures to collapse before they could occur, and entire habitats experienced temporal disorientation as cause and effect lost coherence. But even this failed to break humanity's response, because instead of stabilizing reality, humans leaned into the chaos, allowing localized unpredictability to flourish, turning cities into living experiments where no 2 days followed the same pattern, where artificial intelligences were encouraged to develop quirks and biases rather than suppress them, and where strategic decisions were sometimes made by randomized consensus. The cost was high. Systems failed, Resources were wasted. Mistakes were made publicly and often. But the invaders' advance slowed to a crawl, their formations fracturing, their structures pausing mid-transition as if trapped between incompatible states. It was during this phase that the probe sent earlier finally returned, not physically, but as a signal burst that carried no images, no data, only a distorted echo of human laughter layered over alien telemetry. And analysis revealed something astonishing. The probe had not been destroyed or captured. It had been ignored, dismissed as irrelevant noise by the invaders' systems, because it did not fit any category of threat or value, and that dismissal had allowed it to observe undetected. What it transmitted changed the course of the war. Evidence that the invaders could not process entities that lacked clear purpose, that ambiguity rendered them blind, and humanity realized that victory did not require defeating the enemy, only becoming incomprehensible to it. A new doctrine emerged, without formal approval, never codified, never named, spread organically across networks. Be interesting, be inconsistent, be human. And under this unspoken rule, humanity's response became less like a military campaign, and more like a cultural explosion. New forms of art emerged mid-conflict. Jokes referencing extinction circulated during evacuations. Scientists deliberately pursued multiple contradictory hypotheses simultaneously. And even children were encouraged to invent games with rules that changed randomly, feeding the collective unpredictability that shielded humanity from being fully mapped. The invaders reacted with something approximating frustration. Their movements erratic now. Some structures advancing while others retreated without coordination. And observers noted delays that suggested internal disagreement or recalibration failures. And for the first time, a transmission was intercepted that was not intended for humanity. Fragments of alien communication expressing concern about anomaly saturation and loss of determinism. Humanity had not just resisted. It had infected the invaders with uncertainty. Yet the war was far from over, because even as the enemy struggled, reality itself began to strain under the weight of constant unpredictability. Localized paradoxes formed, technologies behaved inconsistently, and the custodians issued a final warning that humanity's strategy, while effective, threatened to destabilize the larger cosmic framework, potentially endangering countless uninvolved civilizations. And humanity faced its hardest choice yet: continue and risk becoming a universal threat, or restrain themselves and risk annihilation. The debate fractured society, not along political or cultural lines, but philosophical ones. What did survival mean if existence itself became hostile to order? And could humanity live with the consequences of winning this kind of war? As the invaders regrouped for what sensors predicted would be a decisive push toward Earth, humanity prepared for a final act, not of force, but of identity, knowing that whatever they chose next would define not just the outcome of the war, but what it meant to be human in a universe that demanded predictability. The moment humanity realized there would be no return to what they were before, the war stopped feeling like a struggle for survival and became a decision about existence itself. Because the final act would not be measured in territory gained or enemies destroyed, but in what kind of reality would be allowed to continue. And as the alien armada gathered beyond the orbit of Neptune, compressing space into rigid lattices of certainty in preparation for a decisive strike, humanity did something that confused even its own observers. They slowed down. Instead of escalating unpredictability further, instead of amplifying chaos until the universe itself fractured, they began to converge, not toward uniformity, but toward shared intent. A quiet agreement that the next step had to be deliberate rather than reactive. The decentralized creativity cells merged their findings. Philosophers debated with physicists. Artists collaborated with artificial intelligences. And for the first time since the war began, a coherent idea emerged. Not a weapon, Not a strategy, but a message. The demonstration of what humanity was willing to become, and what it refused to sacrifice. The custodians appeared again, not as distant overseers, but as something closer to witnesses, their presence flickering and unstable, as if even they were affected by the ongoing erosion of determinism. And they asked humanity one final question, not whether they could win, but whether they understood the cost of forcing the universe to accept uncertainty as a permanent feature. Humanity answered without words, because words were too precise. Instead, they prepared an event, a single vast act of expression, designed not to harm, but to reveal. And as the alien structures advanced, humanity transmitted not noise this time, not chaos, but a layered signal composed of stories, contradictions, humor, grief, curiosity, hope, fear, and joy, all interwoven, all unresolved, a living snapshot of a species that refused to collapse into a single definition. This signal did not target the invaders' technology directly. It targeted their assumptions, flooding their perception space with a reality that could not be simplified without losing meaning. And the effect was immediate and profound. Alien structures froze mid-transition, their lattices destabilizing, as internal models failed to reconcile the data. Because for the first time, they were not facing randomness, but complexity with purpose. Observers watched as sections of the armada began to disassemble, not violently, but carefully, as if attempting to step back from an edge they had not realized existed. And intercepted fragments of alien communication revealed something no one had expected. Confusion layered with something dangerously close to awe, because humanity was not behaving like prey or rival or anomaly, but like a question that could not be answered without changing the questioner. The invaders had consumed civilizations that were orderly, chaotic, aggressive, peaceful, logical, and emotional, but never one that embraced contradiction as identity. And that realization forced them into a dilemma their nature could not resolve. To continue meant destabilizing themselves. To retreat meant accepting uncertainty as something that could not be erased. As the armada hesitated, humanity did not press the advantage. No attacks followed, no demands were issued, and that restraint carried more weight than any threat, because it demonstrated choice rather than compulsion. The custodians finally intervened, not with force, but with recognition, declaring humanity a non-classifiable civilization, exempt from deterministic consumption under ancient laws that had never before been applied. And that declaration rippled through the alien collective like a fracture, forcing withdrawal protocols to activate across their formations. One by one, the structures folded inward and vanished, not destroyed, but displaced, retreating beyond observable space, leaving behind a universe that felt subtly different. The war ended not with celebration, but with exhaustion. Systems stabilized slowly. Unpredictability was allowed to settle into creativity rather than chaos, and humanity faced the aftermath of its own transformation. They had proven they could survive by becoming something the universe could not easily process. But they also understood that this path required responsibility, because unchecked unpredictability could be as destructive as rigid control. The unified Earth Assembly reformed itself, not as a governing authority, but as a facilitator of balance, encouraging diversity of thought while maintaining shared ethical anchors. And artificial intelligences were redefined, not as tools or equals, but as collaborators in an ongoing experiment called civilization. The custodians remained, no longer silent observers, but cautious partners, admitting that humanity had altered the trajectory of the galaxy by demonstrating that uncertainty could coexist with stability, that meaning could emerge without being forced, and that not all threats needed to be destroyed to be overcome. Generations later, children would once again study war in history archives, but now it was taught not as a failure of morality alone, but as a failure of imagination. a symptom of civilizations that could not adapt without dominating. And when asked about the 1,000-year peace that ended with laughter, elders would smile and explain that the laughter was never ignorance. It was recognition, an instinctive understanding that fear only has power when it is accepted as inevitable. Humanity did not claim victory in the traditional sense, because nothing had been conquered, but the galaxy changed its behavior around them. Exploration routes bent subtly away, ancient threats hesitated, and stories spread of a species that responded to extinction with curiosity instead of despair. The universe had declared war, and humanity had answered by refusing to be simple. And in doing so, they secured not just survival, but the freedom to remain unfinished. A civilization defined not by what it was, but by its willingness to keep becoming something new.